On the morning of March 19, 1818, the geological stability of the Brandywine Valley in Wilmington, Delaware, was permanently altered. At precisely 9:15 a.m., the atmospheric pressure shifted violently as 36,000 pounds of high-grade black powder ignited simultaneously. The resulting detonation was not a single sound, but a series of overlapping shock waves that traveled through the bedrock, shattering window panes in Philadelphia, nearly 30 miles to the north. In the immediate epicenter, the Eleutherian Mills, the most advanced explosive manufacturing facility in the Western Hemisphere, ceased to exist as a structural entity. Fragments of heavy industrial machinery, including cast iron gears and massive grinding stones weighing several tons, were launched into the sky, falling like black hail upon the surrounding forests. The air was instantly saturated with the thick, suffocating stench of sulfur and the metallic tang of vaporized iron. 40 men, the backbone of the company's skilled labor force, were obliterated instantly. Their remains were so thoroughly integrated into the debris that the recovery process was deemed a mathematical impossibility. The technical failure was rooted in the volatile nature of the incorporating mill, where the three primary ingredients of black powder, potassium nitrate, saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal, were ground together under massive stone rollers. The ratio was a precise 75-15-10, a formula perfected by the French chemist Antoine Lavoisier. Any deviation in moisture content or a single spark from a worker's boot nail could turn the facility into a furnace. To mitigate this, Eleuthère-Irénée Dupont had engineered the mills with a specific architectural philosophy. 3 walls were constructed of massive granite blocks, 2 feet thick, while the 4th wall, facing the Brandywine River, was made of light timber. This was a blowout design intended to direct the force of an explosion away from other buildings and toward the water. On this morning, however, the sheer volume of powder rendered the engineering secondary. The explosion did not just blow out the wall, it pulverized the granite itself. The financial loss was recorded at $30,000, a figure that, when adjusted for the specialized industrial purchasing power of 2026, represents a staggering $865,000 hit to the company's liquid capital. This catastrophe occurred during a precarious moment in the American macroeconomy. The panic of 1819 was looming, and the Second Bank of the United States was beginning to contract credit. The U.S. government, still reeling from the debts of the War of 1812, relied almost exclusively on the DuPonts for its defensive capabilities. The loss of the 1818 stock meant the nation was effectively disarmed for months. E.I. Dupont, observing the smoldering craters from his residence at Louviers, did not succumb to grief. His reaction was a display of cold, aristocratic pragmatism. While the families of the deceased workers gathered at the gates, Dupont was already calculating the cost of imported French machinery and the recruitment of new labor. He implemented a strict military-style pension system for the widows, not out of altruism, but to ensure the loyalty of the remaining workforce and to prevent the trade secrets of the French powder from leaking to competitors like the Hazard Powder Company. Among the secondary figures present was Sophie Dupont, the patriarch's daughter, whose meticulous diaries provide the only forensic account of the aftermath. She described the black snow of ash that covered the family's formal gardens and the eerie silence of the river, which had been choked with charred timber. The family lived in a state of perpetual siege, their wealth inseparable from the risk of sudden, violent erasure. The tragedy of 1818 established the Dupont Doctrine, the consolidation of all family assets into a single, unbreakable corporate identity. They realized that in the business of death, the only way to survive was to become the master of the very forces that sought to destroy them. They began to rebuild within weeks, using the same granite that had just failed them. But this time, the foundations were dug deeper into the Delaware soil. The blood of 40 men had been mixed into the mortar of a new American empire, one that would soon demand far more than just a single valley. The family had learned the hard way that power requires a ritual of sacrifice, but they had yet to realize that the most dangerous explosive in their inventory was not the powder in the magazines, but the volatile bloodline that would inherit it. The DuPont saga does not begin in the American wilderness, but in the opulent, decaying chambers of the Ancien Régime. Pierre Samuel Dupont de Nemours, the family patriarch, was a man of the physiocracy, an economic theory asserting that the wealth of nations was derived solely from the value of land agriculture. A protégé of François Quesnay and a personal advisor to King Louis XVI, Pierre Samuel was an architect of the 1783 treaty that ended the American Revolutionary War. However, by 1792, the Enlightenment he championed had turned into the Reign of Terror. Captured and imprisoned in La Force, he escaped the guillotine only by the bureaucratic chaos that followed the death of Robespierre. In 1799, realizing that France was no longer a laboratory for his ideas, he orchestrated a mass exodus. The DuPonts were not fleeing as humble immigrants. They were a displaced elite, carrying with them a library of forbidden chemical knowledge and a capital investment of 450,000 francs, approximately $1.4 million in 2026 value, raised from a syndicate of desperate French aristocrats. They arrived in Newport, Rhode Island on January 1, 1800, aboard the American Eagle after a grueling 91-day crossing. The transition was a profound culture shock. Pierre Samuel expected to found a rural utopia called Pontiana, but his son, Eleuthère Irénée, noticed a more practical opening in the American market. During a hunting trip with a local officer, Irénée was appalled by the poor quality of American gunpowder, which was coarse, inconsistent, and prone to fouling barrels. Having been an apprentice to the legendary Antoine Lavoisier at the Paris Arsenal, Irénée knew the secret to guerre-grade powder, the purification of saltpeter. While American manufacturers used crude potassium nitrate contaminated with magnesium and calcium salts, Irénée brought the technical specifications for a refining process that achieved 99.5% purity. This was the French secret, a technological edge that would make their product the most lethal on the continent. The macroeconomic context of 1802 favored their arrival. Thomas Jefferson, a close friend of Pierre Samuel, had just taken the presidency and was eager to reduce America's dependence on British industrial imports. Despite the administration's public stance on small government agrarianism, Jefferson secretly facilitated the DuPonts' acquisition of land on the Brandywine Creek. The site was chosen with surgical precision. The creek's fall line provided a reliable 90-foot drop over a few miles, generating the hydraulic horsepower necessary to turn massive grinding wheels. Furthermore, the local geology provided an abundance of blue rocks, Wilmington granite, for sturdy construction and willow trees for high-quality charcoal. The family purchased the initial 95 acres from a local farmer named Jacob Broom for $6,740, roughly $195,000 today, marking the birth of the Eleutherian Mills. The internal hierarchy of the family was established during this period of exile. It was a House of DuPont model, where the family and the firm were indistinguishable. Pierre Samuel handled the political lobbying in Washington and the correspondence with European financiers, while Irénée managed the brutal reality of production. Life at the mills was an exercise in aristocratic austerity. They lived in stone houses overlooking the factory, constantly exposed to the vibrations of the machinery and the omnipresent risk of fire. They were social outcasts in Delaware, viewed with suspicion by the local Quaker population for their French Catholicism and their manufacturing of instruments of war. This isolation only served to tighten the family bond, creating a fortress mentality that would persist for 2 centuries. They were no longer French and they were not yet fully American. They were a sovereign entity unto themselves, governed by the laws of chemistry and the demands of the ledger. The early years were a struggle for solvency. The overhead of importing specialized copper tools and French-made sieves that did not produce sparks was immense. By 1804, they had produced their first batch of powder, but the market was skeptical. It took the impending conflict of the Napoleonic Wars and the subsequent War of 1812 to validate their investment. The U.S. government soon realized that the DuPonts were not just manufacturers, they were a strategic asset. However, as the orders for powder increased, so did the friction within the family. Pierre Samuel's grandiose dreams of land speculation often clashed with Irene's grounded industrial reality. The family was arming a young nation, providing the kinetic energy for its expansion and its defense, but they were also creating a legacy of debt and duty that would weigh on every subsequent generation. The weapon they had built for America was indeed double-edged, and the first edge was already starting to cut into the hand that held it. The Ponts had successfully transplanted the secrets of the old world into the soil of the new, but they had also transplanted the European obsession with bloodlines and betrayal, ensuring that their empire would always be a house divided against itself. By the mid-19th century, the Brandywine Valley had ceased to be a mere industrial site. It had become the ballistic heart of a fracturing nation. The leadership fell to Henry DuPont, known throughout Delaware and Washington as the General. A West Point graduate and a man of terrifying discipline, Henry ran the company not as a commercial enterprise, but as a military regiment. Under his tenure, the company's internal culture became an impenetrable thicket of protocols designed to prevent both industrial espionage and accidental combustion. Employees were forbidden from wearing shoes with iron nails, which could strike a spark on the stone floors, and were required to wear specialized powder shoes made of soft leather. Smoking was a capital offense within a 1-mile radius of the magazines. This rigid structure was the only thing preventing the family from being vaporized as they prepared for the American Civil War, the conflict that would elevate them from regional manufacturers to global titans. The technical pivot of this era was led by Lamotte DuPont, Henry's nephew, and the family's most brilliant chemical mind since Irene. In 1857, Lamotte patented bee-blasting powder, a revolutionary innovation that replaced expensive Indian saltpeter, potassium nitrate, with cheaper, more abundant Chilean saltpeter, sodium nitrate. Sodium nitrate was notoriously hygroscopic. It absorbed moisture from the air, rendering it useless in humid conditions. Lamotte solved this through a sophisticated glazing process using graphite and heat, making the powder viable for heavy blasting and mining. This technological leap dropped the cost of production by 30% while increasing the explosive yield. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, the Union's survival depended on this specific chemistry. The DuPonts supplied over 4 million pounds of powder to the Northern effort, effectively deciding the outcome of the war through sheer industrial throughput. By the war's end in 1865, the company recorded a profit of $1.1 million, a sum that in 2026 purchasing power for military-industrial capital exceeds $28.5 million. The macroeconomic landscape of the 1870s was one of brutal consolidation. Following the war, the demand for military powder plummeted, leading to a glut in the market. Henry DuPont's response was the creation of the Gunpowder Trade Association in 1872, popularly known as the Gunpowder Trust. This was an aggressive shadow cartel comprising the Big Three, DuPont, Laughlin and Rand, and the Hazard Powder Company. The trust utilized a quota and fine system. If a member company sold more than its allotted percentage of the national market, it paid a heavy fine into a central fund. If an independent competitor tried to undersell the trust, Henry would authorize predatory pricing, selling DuPont powder at a loss in that specific region until the competitor went bankrupt or sold out to the family. This was the era of the robber barons, and the DuPonts were the most efficient of the breed. They didn't just sell a product, they owned the very air of the American market, ensuring that every railroad blast and every miner's shot paid a private tax to Wilmington. Yet this period of external dominance was mirrored by internal stagnation. Henry refused to adopt new technologies like dynamite, dismissing nitroglycerin as too unstable for a gentleman's business. This technical blindness led to a secret friction within the family. Lamotte, seeing the future in high explosives, was forced to form his own sub-entity, the Rapono Chemical Company, to develop dynamite. In 1884, the inherent danger of the bloodline struck again. Lamotte was killed in a massive nitroglycerin explosion at the Rapono plant. He died trying to stabilize a heating vat of acid. His body never recovered. The death of the family's best chemist left the firm in the hands of aging traditionalists who still used handwritten ledgers and resisted the telephone. The merchants of death were becoming a relic of the past, wealthy beyond measure, but technologically paralyzed. By 1889, Henry DuPont was dead, leaving a vacuum at the top of an empire that controlled 90% of the American explosives market. The family had become the sovereigns of Delaware, owning the newspapers, the banks, and the politicians of the state. They lived in a world where the American government was merely their most consistent client, not their superior. But the world outside was changing. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was being drafted in the halls of Congress, and the era of the unregulated cartel was drawing to a close. The DuPonts had spent a century learning how to master the chemistry of smoke, but they were entirely unprepared for the new chemistry of the 20th century, the chemistry of corporate law and public scrutiny. The monopoly was absolute. The wealth was generational, and the family was finally at peace, unaware that the greatest threat to their survival would not come from a rival's powder or a government's law, but from the sudden, silent heart failure of the next patriarch. The year 1902 marked the closest the DuPont dynasty ever came to extinction. Upon the death of Eugene DuPont, the company's president, the remaining elders of the family reached a chilling consensus. They were tired of the risk. The business had become too complex, the legal pressures too great, and the threat of another Brandywine scale explosion too high. At a tense meeting in the family's ancestral home, the senior partners voted to sell EI, DuPont de Nemours and Company, to their primary rival, Laughlin and Rand, for $12 million. This was more than a business transaction. It was a surrender of a century-old legacy. However, before the ink could dry, a 38-year-old cousin named Alfred DuPont stood up. With a theatrical flair and a deep-seated obsession with the family's honor, he declared that the company was not for sale to outsiders. He offered to buy it himself. The elders, skeptical of Alfred's financial stability, gave him an impossible ultimatum. He had 30 days to raise the capital. Alfred immediately reached out to two cousins, Coleman and Pierre S. DuPont. Together, they executed one of the most brilliant leveraged buyouts in financial history. They didn't use cash. They used the company's own reputation as collateral. They bought the firm for $12 million in 4% notes and 25% of the stock in a newly formed corporation. In today's terms, they secured a $450 million empire with a down payment that was essentially zero, relying entirely on their ability to modernize and increase efficiency. Coleman, a charismatic promoter with experience in the Kentucky coal mines, became president. Pierre, a cold, analytical accountant who viewed the world through the lens of a balance sheet, became treasurer. Alfred, the hands-on machinist who preferred the smell of the mills to the air of the boardroom, became the vice president of operations. The triumvirate immediately set about dismantling the archaic 19th century partnership and replacing it with the U-curve, unitary organizational structure, a model that would later be adopted by every major corporation in the world. Pierre DuPont pioneered the use of return on investment, ROI, as the primary metric for corporate health, a revolutionary concept at a time when most businesses only looked at total profit. He centralized the purchasing, sales, and accounting departments, stripping the individual mill managers of their autonomy. They moved the headquarters from the cramped offices at the mills to the DuPont building in downtown Wilmington, a massive 14-story limestone fortress that functioned as a city within a city, complete with a theater and a hotel. This was the birth of the modern DuPont, a data-driven, hyper-efficient machine designed to maximize every cent of capital. The macroeconomic context of 1902 was defined by the Great Merger Movement. Under the shadow of J.P. Morgan's consolidation of U.S. Steel, the DuPont cousins followed suit, purchasing over 50 rival companies within 3 years. They dismantled the Gunpowder Trust, not to promote competition, but to absorb it. By 1905, they controlled nearly 70% of the American explosives industry, from blasting powder used in the Panama Canal to the smokeless powder used by the U.S. Navy. The technical sophistication reached a peak with the establishment of Eastern Laboratory, one of the first dedicated industrial research facilities in the United States. They were no longer just making powder. They were engineering molecular structures. The investment in R&D was substantial, $300,000 annually in 1904, which translates to a specialized research budget of approximately $10.5 million in 2026. However, the triumvirate was a fragile alliance built on fundamentally different temperaments. Coleman-DuPont was often absent, pursuing political ambitions and building the Coleman-DuPont Road, the first divided highway in America, as a gift to the state and a way to increase the value of his land holdings. Pierre remained obsessed with the precision of the ledger, slowly accumulating a secret majority of shares. Alfred, meanwhile, felt increasingly marginalized by his cousin's corporate maneuvers. He was a man of the old school, believing that the family should rule Delaware as feudal lords, while Pierre believed the family should rule the world as invisible shareholders. The tension was exacerbated by Alfred's scandalous personal life. He was becoming a liability to the pure corporate image Pierre was meticulously crafting. By 1907, the company was a global powerhouse, but the internal cracks were widening into chasms. The triumvirate had saved the empire from being sold, but in the process, they had created a monster that required absolute control. Pierre began to view his cousins not as partners, but as obstacles to the rational management of the firm. The three men who had once stood together against the elders were now eyeing each other with cold, calculated suspicion. The buyout was complete, the modernization was successful, and the fortune was staggering. But the DuPonts were about to learn that when you build a kingdom on the foundation of a coup, you can never truly put down your sword. The cousins had conquered the market, but the next war would be fought in the courtrooms and the bedrooms of Wilmington, and the casualty would be the family name itself. By 1910, the DuPont wealth had reached a level of critical mass where it began to distort the physical and social landscape of Delaware. Alfred Defensor DuPont, increasingly alienated from the corporate mechanicalism of his cousin Pierre, sought to manifest his status through a monument of architectural defiance. He commissioned the firm Carrère and Hastings, the same architects responsible for the New York Public Library, to construct Nemours, a 77-room late 18th century French-style chateau. The estate was not merely a home. It was a 3,000-acre technological fortress designed to outshine the European royalty the DuPonts had once served. The construction utilized over 200,000 cubic feet of Indiana limestone and imported Carrara marble, costing Alfred approximately $2 million in 1910. In the hyperinflated luxury market of 2026, this expenditure represents a concentrated investment of $68, $5 million in residential infrastructure, excluding the priceless art and antique collection housed within. The technical specifications of Nemours were an anomaly for the era. Alfred, an obsessive engineer, insisted on a subterranean labyrinth of service tunnels that allowed staff to move between the mansion and the utility plants unseen. The estate featured its own independent power station, a private water filtration and bottling plant, and a massive ice-making facility that could produce 2 tons of ice daily, at a time when most of America still relied on manual ice harvesting. The gardens were the largest jardin à la française in North America, requiring a specialized hydraulic system to power a series of fountains and a 1-million-gallon reflecting pool. The logistics of maintaining such an estate required a permanent staff of over 50 servants, whose lives were governed by a rigid hierarchy of service. The annual payroll and maintenance costs exceeded $150,000 in 1910, or roughly $5.2 million today, a figure that drained Alfred's liquidity but secured his reputation as the clan's most extravagant prince. This display of wealth occurred against a backdrop of increasing labor unrest and the rise of the progressive era. In 1910, the U.S. government was aggressively pursuing antitrust legislation under President William Howard Taft, and the specter of a federal income tax was looming with the proposed 16th Amendment. While the DuPont workers in the Brandywine mills earned an average of $12 a week, barely enough to sustain a family in a company-owned cottage, Alfred was importing specialized Rolls-Royce Silver Ghosts from England. These vehicles were not stock models. They were customized with shooting brake bodies and specialized toolkits for Alfred's hunting expeditions. He also maintained a 100-foot steam yacht, the Nina Musha, which featured a hull of mahogany and nickel-plated engine components, requiring a crew of 12 and a coal budget that could have heated an entire Delaware village for a winter. The social etiquette of the gilded fortress was an exercise in cold, aristocratic ritual. Guests were expected to adhere to a dress code that changed 5 times a day, and the menus featured out-of-season delicacies preserved in the estate's advanced refrigeration units. However, the opulence was a facade for a profound psychological isolation. Alfred's second wife, Alicia Bradford, was his second cousin, a marriage that deeply offended the sensibilities of the more conservative DuPont elders. The family's internal documents from this period reveal an obsession with correctness, where a breach in dinner table protocol was treated with the same severity as a chemical leak in the factories. The DuPonts were building walls not just to keep the public out, but to keep their own scandals from leaking into the Delaware soil. They had successfully recreated the Versailles of their ancestors, complete with its inherent paranoia and its disconnect from the reality of the 20th century. As Alfred walked the limestone terraces of Nemours, he viewed himself as the true heir to the DuPont legacy, a man of iron and ego. But the macroeconomic tide was shifting. The era of the individual industrialist was being swallowed by the era of the anonymous corporation. Pierre DuPont was watching from the executive offices in Wilmington, viewing Alfred's extravagance not as a sign of strength, but as a structural weakness to be exploited. The gardens were beautiful, the fountains were grand, and the Rolls-Royces were immaculate, but the foundation of Alfred's power was built on a stock certificates that Pierre was already preparing to seize. The Gilded Age of the DuPonts was reaching its atmospheric limit, and the descent would be marked not by a gradual decline, but by a legal explosion that would leave the family's unity in ruins. Alfred had built a fortress to protect his happiness, unaware that the most effective siege engines of the 20th century were not cannons but the ledgers and lawyers of his own kin. In 1913, the social fabric of Delaware was torn apart by a scandal that served as the catalyst for the ultimate DuPont Civil War. Alfred I of DuPont's divorce from his first wife, Bessie Gardner, and his immediate marriage to Alicia Bradford triggered a social freeze-out, orchestrated by the matriarchs of the family. In the rigid hierarchy of Wilmington, divorce was a moral contagion. The family, led by Pierre and his brothers, effectively excommunicated Alfred, removing him from the blue book of acceptable society. But the conflict was never truly about morality. It was about the control of 18,122 shares of the E.I. DuPont de Nemours Powder Company. This block of stock, then valued at $14 million, would be worth an astronomical $460 million in 2026 purchasing power. It represented the swing vote in the family's empire, and Pierre DuPont was determined to ensure it never fell into Alfred's hands or those of any outside interest. The legal technicalities of the era favored Pierre's cold-blooded strategy. In 1914, as Europe descended into the chaos of World War I, Pierre executed a clandestine financial maneuver that remains a case study in corporate betrayal. Coleman DuPont, the triumvirate's president, had fallen ill and wished to sell his stake in the company. Pierre, acting as the company's treasurer, used a secret syndicate, funded by loans from J.P. Morgan and other New York banks, to buy Coleman's shares for himself and his immediate associates, bypassing the other family members. This was a direct violation of the original 1902 agreement, which dictated that any family member wishing to sell should offer their shares to the company or the other cousins first. When Alfred discovered the deal, he realized he had been blindsided. The man who had saved the company from the elders in 1902 was now being evicted by the very cousins he had elevated. The ensuing legal battle, DuPont versus DuPont, lasted from 1915 to 1918 and became the most expensive and publicized litigation in American history to that point. Alfred hired a small army of investigators and the most aggressive lawyers in the country, spending over $1.5 million in legal fees, approximately $48 million today. The courtroom proceedings stripped away the family's carefully curated social mask, revealing a gutter fight of epic proportions. Lawyers argued over voting trusts, fiduciary duties, and the specific language of corporate bylaws. But the underlying narrative was one of primal dominance. Pierre's lieutenant, John J. Raskob, the financial wizard who would later build the Empire State Building, testified with a chilling mathematical precision that made Alfred's appeals to family honor seem like a relic of a bygone age. The macroeconomic context of the 1914-1915 period provided Pierre with a decisive advantage. The onset of the Great War in Europe created an unprecedented demand for explosives. The DuPont company was receiving orders for smokeless powder and TNT on a scale never before imagined. This influx of wartime capital made the company's stock soar, providing Pierre with the leverage he needed to keep the banks on his side. While Alfred was obsessed with the ethics of the share purchase, Pierre was busy transforming the company into a global military contractor. The Federal Reserve Act of 1913 had stabilized the banking system, and Pierre used this new financial infrastructure to consolidate his power, ensuring that Alfred's lawsuits were eventually dismissed by judges who were often socially or financially beholden to the DuPont machine. By 1916, the Delaware divorce was complete. Alfred was not only divorced from his wife and his cousins, but he was also formally voted off the board of directors of the company he had saved. Pierre and his faction held absolute control. The expulsion was total. Alfred's name was removed from company documents, and he was banned from the executive offices. In a final act of spite, the family social circle continued to shun Alicia Bradford, leading Alfred to retreat further into the limestone walls of Nemours. He had the money, he had the mansion, but he had lost the war for the family's soul. The merchants of death were now unified under a single clinical leadership, ready to profit from the carnage in Europe, while the man who provided the heart for the 1902 coup sat in his darkened library, listening to the silence of his 77 rooms. The family had successfully excised its most volatile member, but the wound left behind would never truly heal. The DuPonts were now a corporate monolith, but they had sacrificed their humanity to achieve it. The next decade would bring more wealth than they could ever spend, but the ghost of Alfred's betrayal would haunt the boardroom for generations. The weapon of choice was no longer black powder. It was the signature on a stock transfer, and its effects were far more permanent. As the global equilibrium shattered in 1914, the E.I. DuPont and Nemours Company underwent a metamorphosis from a regional powder manufacturer into the primary industrial engine of the Allied war effort. The technical scale of this expansion was unprecedented in human history. To meet the demands of the British and French governments, the DuPonts constructed the Haskell and Hopewell plants, industrial leviathans built from scratch in less than a year. The Hopewell plant in Virginia alone required a labor force of 25,000 men and consumed 1.5 million gallons of water daily to produce nitrocellulose or gun cotton. The chemical process involved treating purified cotton linters with a precise mixture of nitric and sulfuric acids, a reaction that required constant thermal monitoring to prevent catastrophic decomposition. By 1918, the family had supplied 5 billion pounds of explosives to the Allies, accounting for approximately 40% of the total ammunition used by the Entente powers. The financial return on this carnage was staggering. At the conclusion of the hostilities, the company's net profit reached $90 million in 1918, a figure that, when adjusted for the specialized industrial purchasing power of 2026, represents a liquid capital surplus of $2.45 billion. This war wealth presented a structural problem: how to reinvest such a massive sum without collapsing the domestic market. Pierre Dupont, guided by his financial architect John J. Raskob, made the most significant strategic move in the history of American capital. They invested $50 million, roughly $135 billion today, into a struggling automotive firm called General Motors. This was not a passive investment. It was a vertical integration strategy. The DuPonts realized that the same nitrocellulose chemistry used for explosives could be chemically plasticized into pyroxylin lacquers. This led to the development of Duco paint, the first quick-drying finish that allowed GM to reduce car production time from weeks to hours, effectively ending the monopoly of the Ford Model T's any color as long as it's black philosophy. The 1920s saw the company's technical diversification into the realm of synthetic polymers. In 1928, the DuPonts established Purity Hall, a fundamental research laboratory headed by the brilliant but tormented chemist Wallace Carruthers. Carruthers was given an annual research budget of $250,000, $4.6 million today, and a mandate to explore the molecular structures of polymers. In 1935, his team achieved the first successful synthesis of fiber 66, later branded as nylon. The technical process involved the high-pressure polymerization of hexamethylenidiamine and adipic acid. This was the first entirely synthetic fiber, a material stronger than steel and finer than a spider's web. The commercial launch in 1940 was a cultural phenomenon. 4 million pairs of nylon stockings sold out in a single day. The gilded fortress of the family was now reinforced by the chemistry of consumer desire. But the success came at a steep human cost. Wallace Carruthers, overwhelmed by the pressure and his own clinical depression, committed suicide in a Philadelphia hotel room in 1937 by drinking a cocktail of lemon juice and potassium cyanide, the very chemical his work helped industrialize. While the public marveled at the Better Things for Better Living marketing campaign, a darker narrative was emerging in Washington. In 1934, the Nye Committee, a Senate investigation into the munitions industry, branded the DuPonts as merchants of death. The committee revealed that the family had not only profited immensely from the Great War, but had also lobbied against disarmament treaties to protect their future markets. The archival records from the hearing show a cold, unrepentant Irénée DuPont, son of the 1902 savior, testifying that the profit motive is the only reliable engine of national defense. The macroeconomic context of the mid-1930s was one of extreme hostility toward economic royalists. The DuPonts had become too big for the American government to ignore, and their transition from powder to plastics did not wash the sulfur from their hands. The family had successfully diversified their empire, moving from the battlefield to the wardrobe and the driveway. They controlled the paint on the cars, the tires on the road through their investment in U.S. rubber, and the stockings on the legs of the American housewife. But as the 1930s deepened, the DuPonts found themselves in a direct ideological collision with the White House. The chemistry of their wealth was becoming increasingly toxic to the democratic process, and the family was preparing for a coup that would either secure their absolute dominance or mark them as the greatest traitors in American history. The merchants of death were about to find that the only thing more dangerous than a world at war was a government that was no longer for sale. By 1934, the Great Depression had reduced the American GDP by 30%, but the DuPont fortune remained insulated within a complex architecture of personal holding companies. The primary vehicle was Christiana Securities, a closed-end investment company that allowed the family to control their industrial assets while shielding their dividends from the rising tax rates of the New Deal. In 1934 alone, while 12 million Americans were unemployed, the DuPont company paid out $42 million in dividends, approximately $980 million in 2026 value. To the DuPonts, Franklin D. Roosevelt was not a savior. He was a class traitor whose social programs and labor protections threatened the very foundations of their feudal industrial order. Their response was the formation of the American Liberty League, a high-level political advocacy group funded with an initial $500,000 investment from the family and their allies. The League's public mission was to teach the necessity of respect for the rights of persons and property. But its clandestine objectives were far more radical. In late 1934, Major General Smedley Butler, a two-time Medal of Honor recipient, testified before the McCormick-Dickstein Committee about what would become known as the business plot. Butler claimed he had been approached by a bond salesman named Gerald C. McGuire, who represented a group of wealthy industrialists, led by the DuPont and Morgan interests. The proposal was to lead a private army of 500,000 disgruntled veterans in a march on Washington to seize the White House and install a Secretary of General Affairs, a fascist-style dictator, to run the country, leaving FDR as a mere figurehead. McGuire reportedly assured Butler that the DuPonts have $300 million to back this up, and they control the weaponry. The technical logistics of the plot were mapped out with the same precision as a chemical supply chain. The conspirators intended to use the American Legion as a recruitment base, promising veterans that the new regime would immediately restore the gold standard and dismantle the alphabet soup of New Deal agencies. Archival documents suggest that Irénée Dupont was particularly enamored with the efficiency of European fascist models. He had visited Nazi Germany and was a major financier of the American Eugenics Society, viewing the unfit of the Depression as a biological burden to be managed rather than a citizenry to be helped. The macroeconomic desperation of the era made the threat of a coup a tangible reality. However, the plot collapsed when Smedley Butler, a man of uncompromising integrity, chose his country over his class and blew the whistle. The committee's final report confirmed that there was no doubt that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. Despite the gravity of the accusations, no DuPont was ever indicted. Their influence over the press and the judiciary was absolute. In Delaware, they were the company state. They owned the Wilmington Morning News and the Journal every evening, ensuring that any negative coverage of the family was neutralized. They also maintained a sophisticated lobbying network in the Senate, led by members who owed their seats to DuPont campaign contributions. The 1936 election became a referendum on the family. FDR famously declared in a speech at Madison Square Garden, "They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred." He attacked the economic royalists who sought to government by organized money. The DuPonts responded by pouring $1 million, roughly $23 million today, into the campaign of Alf Landon, FDR's Republican opponent, marking the most expensive attempt by a single family to buy an American presidency to that point. The failure of the Liberty League and the landslide re-election of Roosevelt forced the DuPonts to retreat from overt political insurrection into a more subtle form of systemic control. They began to focus on the scientific management of society, investing heavily in public relations firms like BBDO to sanitize their image. They shifted the narrative from merchants of death to scientists for a new world. But the internal culture of the family remained one of intense paranoid secrecy. The estates along the Brandywine were now fortified with private security forces and early versions of electronic surveillance. The DuPonts realized that if they could not overthrow the government, they would have to outlive it. They began to restructure their wealth into indestructible trusts designed to last for centuries, ensuring that no matter who sat in the Oval Office, the board of directors in Wilmington would hold the real power. The family had survived the scandal of the coup, but the battle with the federal government was only entering its most protracted phase. The Department of Justice was beginning to look into the DuPonts' 23% stake in General Motors, a concentration of power that represented the greatest antitrust challenge in American history. The gilded fortress was about to be besieged not by an army of veterans, but by an army of government lawyers armed with the Sherman Act. The coup had failed, but the war for the American economy was just beginning, and the DuPonts were already mixing a new batch of chemical and legal deterrents. In June 1949, the Department of Justice launched the most significant legal offensive in the history of American capitalism, targeting the very structural integrity of the DuPont empire. The suit, filed in the U.S. District Court in Chicago, aimed to dismantle the holy trinity of industrial power: the interlocking ownership of E.I. DuPont de Nemours, General Motors, and U.S. Rubber. The government's thesis was that the DuPonts had created a closed market where GM was forced to buy fabrics, finishes, and chemicals exclusively from the parent company, regardless of price or quality. The technical heart of this control was Christiana Securities, the family holding company that acted as the financial fortress, allowing a handful of individuals to direct the policies of corporations that employed over 1 million Americans. At the time of the trial, the DuPonts' 23% stake in GM was valued at $3.5 billion, a sum that, in the specialized corporate valuation metrics of 2026, represents a liquid asset concentration of approximately $44.2 billion. The macroeconomic context of the 1950s was defined by the Great Compression, a period where the federal government, under both Truman and Eisenhower, sought to stabilize the middle class by breaking the back of the old money monopolies. The lead attorney for the government was a relentless litigator who argued that the DuPonts were feudal lords in a democratic age. Facing him was Crawford Greenewalt, the president of DuPont and son-in-law to the family, a man who epitomized the new corporate intellectual. Greenewalt was not a powder man. He was a physicist who had worked on the Manhattan Project, helping to build the Hanford nuclear reactors. His defense was a masterpiece of technical obfuscation, arguing that the DuPont-GM relationship was a natural synergy of research and development rather than a conspiracy of greed. The trial dragged on for years, producing over 100,000 pages of evidence and revealing the specific logistics of how the family manipulated global markets through private gentlemen's agreements. In 1957, the Supreme Court delivered the final blow. Justice William Brennan's majority opinion stated that the DuPonts' stock ownership in GM violated the Clayton Act because it gave them a permanent and unfair advantage in the sale of its products. The court ordered the complete divestiture of the 63 million shares of GM stock. This was a financial execution of unprecedented scale. The technical challenge of dumping such a massive volume of shares without crashing the New York Stock Exchange required the passage of a specific act of Congress in 1962, the DuPont Bill, which allowed the family to distribute the shares to their own stockholders as a return of capital rather than as taxable income. This maneuver saved the family billions in taxes, but permanently severed the umbilical cord between the world's largest chemical company and the world's largest automaker. The archival fallout of the divestiture revealed the end of the social mask. During the discovery phase, internal letters between family members surfaced, showing a deep-seated contempt for the encroaching socialism of the American government. The DuPonts felt that the nation they had armed and built was now cannibalizing them. Secondary figures, such as the various DuPont aunts and cousins who lived on the dividends of Christiana Securities, suddenly found themselves facing a world where their divine right to industrial control was subject to the whims of federal regulators. The era of the family-run monolith was over, replaced by the era of institutional investors and the professionalized CEO. The DuPonts were forced to retreat into Delaware, their influence now constrained by the very laws they had spent a century trying to bypass. By the mid-1960s, the company was a ghost of its former political self. While it remained a chemical titan, pioneering materials like Lycra, Kevlar, and Mylar, the central authority of the family was evaporating. The wealth was being split among over 1,600 descendants, diluting the triumvirate model of control into a fragmented collection of trusts and foundations. The antitrust guillotine had not made the family poor, but it had made them irrelevant to the grand strategic movements of the American state. They were no longer the sovereigns of Delaware. They were merely its most prestigious taxpayers. The mask had fallen, and behind it lay a dynasty that was beginning to rot from the inside out, disconnected from the source of its original power. The family had lost the battle for the American economy, and in the silence of their Brandywine estates, a new and far more dangerous enemy was emerging. The psychological instability of the fourth and fifth generations. The wealth was no longer a tool for empire building. It had become a petri dish for madness. By the 1980s, the DuPont fortune had transitioned from an active industrial force into a passive, suffocating legacy. The wealth, once measured in tons of gunpowder, was now measured in the isolation of its heirs. Nowhere was this more evident than at Leicester Hall Farm and later Foxcatcher Farm, the 800-acre estate of John Eleuthère DuPont. John was the great-great-grandson of the founder. Born into a world where every whim was satisfied by a trust fund that generated tens of millions in annual income. In the 2026 economy, John's personal net worth exceeded $850 million, yet he lived in a state of sensory and psychological deprivation. The architecture of his life was defined by the fortress of paranoia, a sprawling complex of high-security fences, thermal imaging cameras, and a private security force that rivaled small-town police departments. The technical layer of John's obsession was centered on Foxcatcher National Training Center, a world-class wrestling facility he built on his property. The facility was an engineering marvel, featuring state-of-the-art mats, sports medicine clinics, and a high-altitude training chamber. However, the logistics of the camp were sinister. John used his wealth to buy athletes, recruiting Olympic champions like Mark and Dave Schultz by offering them six-figure stipends and housing on the estate. This was not a sports program. It was a private human collection. John, who had no athletic talent of his own, insisted on being called Golden Eagle and forced the wrestlers to participate in staged matches where he was allowed to win. The power dynamic was a twisted modern version of the 19th century company town. The athletes were entirely dependent on a man whose grip on reality was disintegrating under the influence of cocaine, alcohol, and undiagnosed paranoid schizophrenia. The macro context of the 1980s favored the rise of the eccentric billionaire. In the Reagan era, the ultra-wealthy were deified, and their eccentricities were often dismissed as the quirks of genius. John DuPont used this cultural cover to expand his personal armory. He purchased a fleet of armored personnel carriers and a surplus M60 Patton tank, which he frequently drove through his manicured fields, convinced that the trees were actually robotic spies sent by the FBI. He had the estate's security cameras upgraded to military-grade night vision, and spent his nights in a command center, watching the silent footage of his own gardens. The archival trivia of his life is a catalogue of absurdity. He once ordered the British Guiana 1C Magenta, the world's rarest postage stamp, for $935,000, roughly $4.5 million today, only to keep it in a dark safe, rarely looking at it, deriving pleasure only from the knowledge that no one else could possess it. Secondary figures in this drama, like his mother Jean Austen DuPont, attempted to maintain the social mask of the family until her death in 1988. Jean was a legendary breeder of Welsh ponies and a pillar of the equestrian establishment. Her death removed the final psychological anchor for John. Without her presence, he descended into a dark fantasy world where he believed he was a Dalai Lama, a Russian spy, and the last true American patriot. He began to carry a .44 Magnum at all times, even while coaching wrestling sessions. The other members of the DuPont family, now scattered across the globe and obsessed with their own philanthropic and financial interests, largely ignored the warnings coming from Foxcatcher. They viewed John as an embarrassment to be managed by lawyers, failing to realize that the chemistry of exile had produced a human explosive far more volatile than any black powder. The technical decline of the family was now a physical reality. The Brandywine Moinhouse were now silent museums, and the great mansions like Namor's were increasingly open to the public as the costs of maintenance became prohibitive for the younger generations. The DuPonts were no longer making history. They were being consumed by it. John DuPont was the ultimate expression of this decay, a man who had everything and possessed nothing. He had built a fortress to keep the world out, but he had succeeded only in trapping his own demons inside. The atmosphere at Foxcatcher was heavy with the scent of gun oil and unwashed wrestling mats, a claustrophobic environment where the only thing missing was a spark. As the 1990s approached, the paranoia at the farm reached its atmospheric limit. John began to fire his security staff, accusing them of being shape-shifting aliens. He lived in a single room of his massive mansion, surrounded by piles of bird-watching journals and weapons. The fortress of paranoia was no longer a defense mechanism. It was a cage. The family's century-long obsession with secrecy and control had culminated in a man who could no longer distinguish his own reflection from an enemy combatant. The explosion was no longer a question of if, But when? And the target would not be a rival corporation or a government agency, but the one man who had tried to be John's friend. On the afternoon of January 26, 1996, the thermometer at Foxcatcher Farm in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania, hovered at a frigid 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The atmosphere was brittle, matching the psychological state of John Eleuthère Dupont. John, driving a silver Lincoln Town car, a vehicle designed for American executive comfort but used here as a mobile command post, approached the driveway of the estate's guest house. Standing in the driveway was Dave Schultz, an Olympic gold medalist and a man who had mistakenly viewed John as a patron rather than a predator. Without a word of warning, John lowered the window and discharged 3 rounds from a .44 Magnum Charter Arms revolver. The technical ballistic profile of the .44 Magnum is one of devastating kinetic energy, designed to stop large game. At a range of less than 10 feet, the outcome was mathematically certain. The first bullet struck Schultz in the arm, the second in the back as he turned to flee, and the third in the chest. Schultz died in the snow, his blood seeping into the frozen Delaware Valley soil that had sustained the DuPont fortune for nearly 2 centuries. The macroeconomic and political context of 1996 was defined by the peak of the Clinton-era Great Moderation, a period of perceived stability where the old industrial titans were being eclipsed by the silicon-based wealth of the West Coast. Yet, at Foxcatcher, John DuPont lived in a distorted reenactment of the 19th century feudal system. He spent approximately $5 million annually, equivalent to $10.5 million in 2026, to maintain his private wrestling army. This expenditure included the technical maintenance of a world-class training center equipped with custom-engineered wrestling mats, industrial-grade ventilation systems to maintain a constant 68-degree training temperature, and a specialized video analysis suite that was decades ahead of its time. However, this infrastructure was not serving the sport. It was a life support system for a man who believed he was being hunted by invisible enemies. The technical failure was not in the security hardware, but in the social architecture that allowed a billionaire to descend into homicidal psychosis without intervention. Following the shooting, the ensuing standoff was a logistical nightmare for the Pennsylvania State Police and the FBI. John retreated into his fortress of paranoia, the main mansion of the estate, which he had reinforced with bulletproof glass and steel-lined doors. The standoff lasted 48 hours. A period during which the police utilized specialized technical equipment, including remote-controlled robots and thermal imaging, to monitor John's movements through the 100-room labyrinth. The authorities were forced to use a specific tactic. They cut the mansion's external boiler system, allowing the winter cold to penetrate the limestone walls. John, whose physical health was failing due to years of substance abuse and a sedentary lifestyle, was eventually captured when he walked outside to attempt to fix the heater. The arrest of a DuPont for murder was a structural shock to the American class system, signaling that the gilded immunity of the Brandywine elite had finally reached its expiration date. The archival records of the 1997 trial reveal a defense strategy built on the sheer scale of the family's wealth. John's legal team, led by the most expensive litigators in the country, argued a defense of diminished capacity, claiming John suffered from integrative aphasia. They pointed to his bizarre rituals, such as his belief that the trees on his estate moved at night, and his obsession with the occult properties of his rare bird collection. The trial cost John's estate an estimated $15 million in legal fees and expert testimony, roughly $31 million in 2026 value. Despite the evidence of profound mental illness, the jury delivered a verdict of guilty but mentally ill, sentencing the heir to 13 to 30 years in prison. This was the final, violent collapse of the social mask. The DuPont name, once synonymous with national defense and scientific progress, was now permanently tethered to the image of a broken man clutching a revolver in the snow. Secondary figures in this act, such as Nancy Schultz, Dave's widow, became symbols of the human cost of the DuPont eccentricity. The family's response was one of clinical distance. They distanced themselves from John's actions, focusing on the legal preservation of the trust funds that remained untouched by the scandal. John died in a Pennsylvania prison in 2010 at the age of 72. His death marked the end of the most visible branch of the dynasty's madness, but it left behind a legacy of unanswered questions about the intersection of extreme wealth and accountability. The gunpowder that had built the empire had finally ignited within the bloodline itself, leaving a crater that no amount of philanthropy could fill. The cycle of the 1818 explosion was complete. Once again, the Brandywine had claimed its sacrifice. But this time, the victim was not an anonymous worker, but the very soul of the family. The fortress was empty, the wrestler was dead, and the gold-plated eagle had finally fallen from its perch, leaving the ruins of the empire to be picked over by lawyers and historians who found only the cold, metallic taste of a legacy gone wrong. The 21st century arrived for the DuPonts not with a bang, but with the sterile click of a corporate merger. In 2017, the E.I. DuPont de Nemours and Company entered into a $130 billion merger with the Dow Chemical Company, creating Dow DuPont, a temporary titan that would eventually be split into 3 independent entities: Dow, Corteva, and a new DuPont. Adjusted for the hyper-consolidated industrial market of 2026, this transaction represented a $168 billion reconfiguration of the American chemical landscape. The merger was a defensive maneuver, a technical unknitting of a 2-century-old tapestry designed to protect shareholder value from the mounting liabilities of the family's chemical past. The centralized power of the DuPont family had finally evaporated, replaced by the anonymous, algorithmic control of index funds and institutional investors like BlackRock and Vanguard. The technical layer of the modern DuPont legacy is defined by a chemical paradox. The same innovation that created better things for better living also created the forever chemical crisis. The manufacturing of Teflon, polytetrafluoroethylene, involved the use of PFOA and PFOS, synthetic compounds that do not break down in the environment or the human body. The logistics of the Chemours spin-off in 2015 were a masterclass in legal engineering. The parent company transferred its most toxic environmental liabilities to this new entity, attempting to insulate the core DuPont assets from billions of dollars in litigation. In 2021, the companies were forced to reach a $4 billion settlement for environmental remediation, a figure that continues to climb as modern filtration technology reveals the ubiquity of DuPont chemicals in the global water supply. The empire's most enduring monument is not a palace, but a molecular bond that will outlast the pyramids. Today, the physical ruins of the empire have been converted into museum estates, the cathedrals of a dead religion. The Hagley Museum and Library preserves the original 1802 mills on the Brandywine, where tourists can witness the water-powered grindstones that once armed the Union. The logistics of maintaining these sites are staggering. The Longwood Gardens, the former estate of Pierre S. DuPont, requires an annual operating budget of over $100 million, roughly $128 million in 2026, to manage its 1,000 acres of conservatories and synchronized fountain displays. These sites serve as a social filter, presenting a sanitized version of the DuPont history, where the merchants of death are reimagined as benevolent patrons of horticulture and science. The 3,500 living descendants of E.I. DuPont are now a fragmented diaspora of wealth, many of whom have no connection to the chemical industry, their lives governed by the perpetual trust structures established by Pierre a century ago. The macroeconomic shift from industrial production to financial management is complete. The DuPont building in Wilmington, once the command center of American explosives, has been partially converted into luxury apartments and a Marriott hotel. The state of Delaware itself remains a company state, but its allegiance is no longer to a family name, but to the over 1.5 million corporations that are incorporated there due to the legal precedents established by DuPont lawyers in the early 1900s. The archival trivia of the current era reflects a diluted prestige. A DuPont heir is more likely to be found on a board of a nonprofit or in a private equity firm than in a laboratory. The Gilded Fortress has been democratized into a series of gift shops and educational centers where the scent of sulfur has been replaced by the smell of high-end floor wax and expensive lattes. As we look back at the 224-year trajectory of the DuPonts, we see a narrative of transition from the chemistry of destruction to the chemistry of survival. They moved from the black powder that broke the earth to the synthetic polymers that colonized the human body. They mastered the art of the corporate pivot, surviving wars, depressions, and antitrust guillotines by becoming invisible. The family proved that absolute power does not necessarily end in a single spectacular collapse, but can be sustained through the cold, methodical application of legal and financial engineering. The Brandywine thunder of 1818 has settled into the background noise of the global economy, a low-frequency hum that most people no longer hear, even as they cook on Teflon pans and wear clothes woven from DuPont fibers. In the valley where it all began, the granite mills still stand, cold and silent against the rushing water of the creek. They are the headstones of an era when a single family could arm a nation and dictate the terms of its survival. The fortune has been divided, the secrets have been filed away in climate-controlled archives, and the bloodline has been thinned by the passage of time and the weight of its own history. The DuPonts did not just control America for decades, they engineered the very fabric of its modern reality, leaving behind a world that is chemically and financially inseparable from their name. In the valley of the Brandywine, the earth still holds the sulfur. A reminder that for the DuPonts, the secret to immortality was never the gold, but the cold-blooded ability to survive the very explosions they created.